During World War II and the period leading up to it, flying boats were still a major factor in military aviation. They provided both direct combat roles and auxiliary roles like personnel transport, reconnaissance, and even things like mail delivery to many of the world's navies. The primary flying boat for the US Navy at the time was the PBY Catalina, which was capable, but something larger was still needed. The Martin Company developed the Model 162A, which received funding in 1937 and first flew in 1939. The new plane was a general step up in capabilities, and it represented a very promising design pretty well suited to military service. Navy planners felt that Martin had struck a good balance between size, cost, and overall utility. It had adequate defensive gun turrets for its time, reasonable engine power and flight performance, combined with the flexibility to be kitted out for a variety of different roles. The plane was designated PBM for Patrol Bomber Martin by the US Navy, and it entered service in late 1940. The planes were immediately put into use, performing highly controversial neutrality patrols over the Atlantic, and they proved fairly successful in that role. One of the more distinctive features of the PBM was its extreme flight endurance time, allowing for missions over 12 hours depending on weather and mission loads. To make life a little easier for the aircrew, many of these planes even had a full galley including a stove, along with bunks for the crew to rest during breaks. The first combat use for the PBM was in the anti-submarine role out over the Atlantic, where it proved its worth and sunk either 9 or 10 German U-boats depending on source. Later models were modified for service out in the Pacific, starting with the Miscellaneous campaign, and served all the way through the end of the war, with some even flying during the Korean War. The Mariner was phased out by the US Navy starting in the late 1950s, but it flew for a few foreign navies well into the 1960s. What we get in War Thunder is the PBM-5A, the last major variant of the plane. This is a torpedo bomber in Rank 3 of the American Air Tree at Battle Rating 3.7 and is the main aviation prize for the Skilled Marksman Battle Pass season in the summer of 2024. The PBM carries the AN/APS-31 radar set, which is search only and a rare example of an anti-ship radar in War Thunder, as it only detects ships and very large objects on the ground, like airfield bunkers. The utility is somewhat limited, but it can still serve a niche by allowing the plane to find targets a little bit more easily out in naval battles without having to climb up too much for visibility. For defenses, the plane has 5 gun turrets and 5 gunners, all equipped with M2 Browning machine guns. For loadouts, the PBM has a bomb bay in each engine nacelle, which can carry dumb bombs or magnetic mines. It can also carry a pair of torpedoes externally, and the overall bomb weight is fairly high for this battle rating. The torpedoes it gets are the Mark 13-6, and you have to be careful and drop these under 100 meters at fairly slow airspeeds. They have a pretty average warhead for a torpedo with this BR, and they're actually kind of difficult to deploy using this plane. More on that later. The Type A magnetic mines are actually fairly interesting, and the utility of these things might surprise you. I discuss these a bit later in the video. The flight performance of the PBM is, well, it's full of bad news. This is a very large and very heavy flying boat with only 2 engines. It's not especially underpowered, but it's still quite slow, and the rate of climb is below average if you have a useful combat load. It's got a low maximum speed, noticeably slower than most of the single-engine fighters it faces, and it really doesn't maneuver too well, not that you'd expect it to anyway. Compounding this is that in a dive, the airspeed is pretty hard to control. It's got combat flaps that it can deploy at basically any realistic airspeed, but no air brake or anything, and you have to use very shallow dives and spirals to avoid a wing rip. Generally speaking, this is a twin-engine bomber that feels more like a 4-engine bomber that's missing an engine. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you know that I unironically enjoy flying prop bombers, but I'll say plainly that the PBM-5A was slightly disappointing with its flight performance. Taking this plane out into air battles is gonna feel familiar if you've done low to mid-tier bomber stuff before. Unfortunately, you don't have the rate of climb to get above enemy interceptors, and even runway fighters can catch you if they keep up a good climb angle. Add to this, the defensive guns have huge blind spots on almost the entire bottom hemisphere, like most flying boats. So you're going to end up being pretty vulnerable to attacks from below. Now the good news is that the bomb load is enormous, and you can easily take out 2 bases in one flyout. The PBM also has lots of empty space internally, and it can survive pretty significant amounts of damage and still be combat effective. Now if you want to fly this out as close air support over a ground battle, the huge bomb load will again be an enormous asset, and the loadout of 8 1,000-pounders can put out some serious damage. Being a large bomber though, lining up accurate drops can be tricky, but you still get the optical bomb sight, so that helps out a bit. Now I want to talk about the Type A Mark I magnetic sea mines for a moment. These are a pretty interesting weapon. They're floating sea mines in an aerodynamic sheath that you can deploy against ground or naval targets. They've got a really good blast radius, and believe it or not, they're actually really effective to use when flying close air support. And it's a little known fact, by the way, but under Maritime Admiralty law, you're actually required to laugh like a maniac if you're able to blow up a land vehicle using a naval sea mine. Now if you want to use these against ships, you can try for a direct impact like a bomb, or drop them in front of the ship you want to attack. They'll float in the water and then blow up if something bumps into them, but just be aware that they're really easy to avoid if the ship just turns out of the way slightly. Still, great to throw out on capture points in a naval battle though. The Mark 13 torpedoes are a different story. In order to avoid drowning the torpedo, you have to drop them under 100 meters and under 200 kilometers an hour airspeed. In a smaller plane, that really wouldn't be much of an issue, but in this thing, it's actually fairly challenging to get low altitude drops lined up at the right airspeed, and it leaves you incredibly vulnerable to attack. This was honestly one of the most difficult planes I've flown in the game to get accurate torpedo shots off with. Visually, the 3D model on this plane is very well detailed. If you like high-mounted gull-wing designs, you'll enjoy the PBM, and generally it's a fairly typical looking flying boat. I kinda wish we had a post-war US Coast Guard paint job for it though. Landing the Mariner on water is easy. You just slow down and set down, same as other flying boats. On land, it's more tricky. You can deploy gear and landing flaps at any realistic airspeed, but the plane lumbers on final really bad, and it's got a pretty long landing run. It's actually a fairly difficult plane to land, and I strongly suggest trying to set down below 160 kilometers an hour if at all possible, because this plane just has so much girth, it just doesn't want to slow down even with full brakes. The cockpit is an awful low-poly placeholder with bad visibility and pretty ugly internals. I can't recommend flying this one with a VR headset. To close out on the PBM-5A Mariner. This plane has anti-ship radar, an absolutely enormous bomb load, it can take sea mines, and it gets premium bonuses. However, its flight performance is pretty bad, even for a flying boat. Its defensive guns have huge blind spots, and it's really difficult to line up torpedo attacks. The final verdict on the PBM-5A is that this plane feels more useful as a conventional bomber than in any kind of naval roles, and its position in rank 3 means that you can use it for events and stuff, and if you can avoid interception, it might make a good points grinder for you. It'll never be a rock star, but its huge bomb load saves it from being a total struggle bus. As always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, check out this other one.